The day Ezekiel Covington led his prize black stallion through the gates of the Aldridge property was the same day the whole town of Redemption, Texas, stopped breathing. Nobody could quite believe what they were seeing. That horse, that magnificent, barrel-chested, thundercloud-black animal with white stockings on his front legs and a mane that caught the wind like a battle flag, was worth more than most men in Harker County would earn in 3 years of honest labor. Folks had offered Ezekiel sums that would make your jaw drop, and he had turned every single one of them down without a second thought. The stallion, which he called Midnight Justice, was not merely a horse to Ezekiel Covington. He was the crowning achievement of 4 years of careful breeding, patient training, and something that bordered on love. And yet there he was, walking that horse straight toward the old barn that belonged to the most talked-about family in Redemption, and he was not smiling. The year was 1882. Redemption sat in the sprawling dust of West Texas, a cattle town still finding its legs after the war years had hollowed out so many families. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing commerce and strangers in equal measure, and with them had come new kinds of trouble. The town had a general store, a livery, a telegraph office, a church with a crooked steeple, 2 saloons, and a courthouse that smelled like pipe tobacco and old grievances. It was a town that remembered things for a long time, and it held grudges the way the desert held heat, slowly releasing them long after you thought the day was done. The Aldridge family had been in Redemption almost since its founding. Harold Aldridge had built the first fence posts himself, back in 1861, before everything fell apart. He had been a good man by all accounts, a cattleman with a fair handshake and a reputation that stretched 3 counties. He had died the previous spring, leaving behind a modest ranch, a handful of debts, and a daughter whose name every tongue in town seemed to know. Kate Aldridge was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she kept in a practical braid most days, and eyes the color of Deep Creek water in summer, not quite green, not quite gray, but something in between that changed with the light and with her mood. She was tall for a woman of her era, which some people seemed to find unsettling, and she walked with the kind of steady confidence that comes not from ease but from surviving things that should have broken you. She was not fragile, and she did not pretend to be, and this was something the town's more traditional residents had never quite forgiven her for. But none of that was why her name was on every lip in Redemption in the summer of 1882. It was her father's name that had become the problem, or rather, what someone had done to it. 3 months after Harold Aldridge was buried, a man by the name of Silas Drury had walked into the office of Judge Percival Holt and presented a set of documents that he claimed proved Harold had stolen cattle from 3 neighboring ranches in the years before his death. The documents were detailed, signed by supposed witnesses, and accompanied by a land lien that, if upheld, would strip Kate of the ranch itself. Drury was a land speculator who had arrived in Redemption on the same train as the railroad money, and he had a gift for paperwork and a jaw that always looked like it was about to smile without ever quite getting there. He wore expensive boots and a clean hat, and he never raised his voice, which somehow made him more frightening than any man who did. The accusation had split the town. Harold's old friends and neighbors knew the charge was impossible. Harold Aldridge had been many things: stubborn, proud, sometimes too quiet, but a thief. Never in his life. But Drury had papers, and papers in a courthouse carried more weight than a dead man's reputation, and the trial date had been set for September. Kate had spent the months since her father's death doing 2 things simultaneously: running the ranch on very little sleep, and trying to prove that the documents Drury had presented were forgeries. She had written letters to cattle associations, to the county record's office, to anyone who might help her find the truth. Most letters went unanswered. The few that were answered told her politely that without contradicting documentation, the claim would likely stand. The land lien meant she could not sell the property, could not borrow against it, and could barely maintain operations. She was, in the careful and legal language of the time, slowly being strangled. This was the situation into which Ezekiel Covington had ridden when he arrived in Redemption 6 weeks before the trial date. He was 30 years old, though he wore it in a way that suggested he had lived those years at full gallop. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that was always a week past needing a cut, and hands that were scarred and capable in the way that only years of rope and leather and hard work could produce. He had grown up on a ranch 2 counties north, the second son of a family that had given him good values and not much else, and he had spent the better part of a decade building something of his own. Midnight Justice was the centerpiece of that something. He had bought the Stallion's dam as a young filly, had bred her carefully, had raised the foal through its first uncertain months, and had trained him personally over the course of 3 years until the horse was something close to perfect. Ezekiel had heard about the Aldridge situation from a fellow cattleman named Warren Price at a stock sale up in Abilene. He had listened to the story with the careful, still expression that was his habit, asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and then said almost nothing for the rest of the evening. 3 days later, he had ridden south toward Redemption without explaining himself to anyone. He first saw Kate Aldridge on a Tuesday morning in early August, at the general store. She was arguing with the store's proprietor, a heavy-set man named Calhoun, over the price of flour, and she was doing it with the kind of measured, iron-backed patience that made Ezekiel stop in the doorway and pay attention. She was not shouting. She was not pleading. She was laying out facts with a clarity and precision that made the storekeeper look slightly smaller with each exchange. And when she finally accepted a compromise price that was still not fair, she did it with a nod that carried more dignity than most victory speeches. Ezekiel moved aside to let her pass through the doorway. She glanced at him briefly, the instinctive, assessing look that women in frontier towns developed when encountering strangers. And then she was past him and down the steps, and moving toward a small buckboard wagon with the economy of someone who had 100 things yet to do before sundown. He watched her go without saying a word, and then he went inside and bought his tobacco and asked Calhoun 2 careful questions about the land situation and the name Silas Drury. Over the next few days, Ezekiel made it his quiet business to learn everything he could about the forgery case. He was not an obvious man. He did not ask questions in the saloon or make himself known at the courthouse. He talked to the livery man who talked to everyone. He talked to the telegraph operator, a young woman named Dottie Sellers, who had sharp ears and a sharp memory. He talked to old Gus Painter, who had been one of Harold Aldridge's closest friends, and who sat most afternoons in front of the barber shop, willing to talk to anyone who would listen. What Ezekiel learned confirmed what he had already suspected. The documents Drury had produced bore the signature of a man named Robert Chambers, who was listed as a witness to the alleged cattle thefts. Robert Chambers, however, had died of fever in 1879, 3 years before the dates on the documents. This was something that Kate herself had discovered and had brought to Judge Holt's attention. But Holt had said that, without original records proving Chambers' death on those specific dates, the contradiction was not sufficient to dismiss the case. Kate needed the death registry entry from the county where Chambers had died, which was Comanche County, over 100 miles away, and she had no money to send anyone to retrieve it and no way to get there herself with the ranch to run. There was a second problem. Even if the death records were retrieved, Drury had a second witness listed on the documents, a man named Fletcher Ames who was very much alive, and who, for reasons that required no great imagination to understand, was fully prepared to stand up in court and confirm the fabricated story. Ames was known in several counties as a man who could be persuaded by financial interest, and Drury clearly had persuaded him thoroughly. Ezekiel turned all of this over in his mind for a day and a half before he arrived at a plan. It was on the 5th day after his arrival in Redemption that he rode out to the Aldridge ranch. The property was modest but well kept in the way that suggested constant effort rather than ease. The fence posts were straight, the yard was clear, and the small vegetable garden beside the house showed someone had been watering it carefully. Two ranch hands moved around the yard, an older Mexican man named Tomas and a young boy of perhaps 16 who was Harold's nephew, a boy called Richie, who had come to help Kate after her father's death. Kate came out of the barn when she heard the approach of hooves. She was carrying a bucket and had a smear of something dark across one cheekbone, and she looked at Ezekiel with the same steady, assessing gaze he had seen at the general store. "Help you with something," she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected, unhurried. "I was hoping to speak with you, Miss Aldridge," he said. "My name is Ezekiel Covington. I have some information that might be useful to you regarding the Drury claim." She did not look immediately welcoming, which he respected. "Are you a lawyer?" she said. "No, ma'am." "A lawman?" "No." "Then what kind of information would a stranger have about my situation that I haven't already found myself?" "The kind that requires knowing where to look," he said, "and I have an idea about that." She considered him for a long moment, then set down the bucket. "Come inside then," she said, without warmth but without hostility either, and that was enough for a beginning. The house was small and tidy and smelled of coffee and pine soap. She poured 2 cups without asking him if he wanted one, which he found agreeable, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table and folded her hands and waited. He laid out what he had learned methodically, starting with the death date discrepancy on Robert Chambers, then moving to the question of Fletcher Ames. He watched her face as he spoke. She did not react with surprise at the information about Chambers. She already knew it. She listened carefully to his analysis of what it would take to actually use that information in a way the court would accept. "I know all of this," she said when he had finished. "I know I need the death records from Comanche County. I know I need someone to deal with Fletcher Ames. I know exactly what the gaps are, Mr. Covington. Knowing them and filling them are 2 different things when you have no money and no time." "I know," he said simply. She looked at him. "So what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing to go to Comanche County myself and retrieve the death registry records. I know the county clerk there. We did business together 2 years ago when I was driving cattle through. He will let me access the records and he will certify the copies properly. That part I can handle. And Fletcher Ames." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment. "That part is more delicate. But there is a man in this county who Fletcher Ames owes a very significant debt to, not a financial debt, a personal one. If that man were to speak privately to Ames, I believe Ames might reconsider his willingness to commit perjury." Kate studied him with an expression that was not yet trust but was at least curiosity. "And why would you do any of this? You don't know me. You have no stake in what happens to this ranch." It was the question he had been expecting, and he had decided in advance to answer it honestly but briefly. "I knew your father slightly," he said. "We met at a cattle drive in 1878. He helped me out of a difficult situation with nothing in return, and I never got the chance to settle that account. Consider this a late payment." It was not the whole truth, but it was true as far as it went, and he said it in a way that discouraged further inquiry. Kate looked at him for another long moment, then nodded once. "All right," she said. "But I want to know what it will cost, because I can't pay you in anything but honesty about what I have, which isn't much." "It won't cost you anything," he said, and before she could object to that, he stood up and said he would ride to Comanche County in the morning and would be back within the week. He was gone before she could ask more questions, which was exactly what he intended. What Ezekiel did not tell Kate, what he had told nobody, and would not tell anyone for a long time, was that the trip to Comanche County was only one piece of the plan, and not the most difficult one. The most difficult piece had to do with Silas Drury himself, and a conversation Ezekiel had had 2 days prior with a man named Gideon Marsh, who was the largest cattle buyer in Harker County, and who had been trying to purchase Midnight Justice for the better part of 2 years. Gideon Marsh was also, as it happened, the man to whom Fletcher Ames owed the personal debt Ezekiel had referenced. The arrangement Ezekiel had worked out in his head was this: Marsh would speak to Ames and persuade him to recant. In exchange for this favor, Ezekiel would sell him midnight justice at a price well below what the horse was worth. The price Marsh had originally offered before the horse had won 2 regional competitions and become considerably more valuable. What made this arrangement genuinely costly rather than merely uncomfortable was that Midnight Justice had been entered in the West Texas Cattlemen's Championship, a race and exhibition held in October that carried both a substantial prize and the kind of prestige that could transform a breeding operation from respectable to extraordinary. Selling the horse now, before that competition, meant surrendering not just the animal but the future that animal represented. It meant walking away from the thing Ezekiel had built most deliberately. But he had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was clear. Without Ames's recantation and the death records in hand, Kate's chance of winning at trial was not good. Judge Holt had a reputation for going where the paper led, and Drury's papers were thorough. The land would go to Drury, the Aldridge name would be permanently blackened, and Kate would have nothing to show for 4 years of working that ranch alongside her father, and then alone after his death. The injustice of it sat in Ezekiel's chest like a coal, steady and burning. He had seen this pattern before: speculators arriving in frontier towns and using the courts as weapons, turning the law into an instrument of dispossession. The law was supposed to protect people like Harold Aldridge and his daughter, and instead it was being used against them, and everyone in town who knew the truth was either too afraid or too comfortable to say so loudly. That was a thing Ezekiel had never been able to abide. He was not a man who made speeches or started arguments, but he was also not a man who could watch an obvious wrong proceed unchallenged when he had the means to interrupt it. He rode to Comanche County in 2 hard days, taking the route through the hill country that cut some miles off the journey. He arrived at the county seat, a dusty little town called Millview, on a Thursday afternoon, and he went directly to the records office before it closed for the day. The county clerk was a thin, meticulous man named Arthur Prewitt, who recognized Ezekiel immediately and offered him a handshake and a chair. Ezekiel explained what he needed without excessive detail, and Prewitt, who had his own opinions about men like Silas Drury and the damage they did to honest communities, was more than willing to help. He located Robert Chambers's death entry in the county registry, a clean, official notation dated March 14, 1879, and prepared a certified copy with the county seal, which carried legal weight in any Texas court. Ezekiel studied the document carefully before folding it into his coat. The date was unmistakable. Chambers had been dead for 3 years before his name appeared on Drury's fabricated witness statements. No living man could explain that away. He spent the night in Millview and rode back at first light, pushing hard and arriving in Redemption late on a Saturday evening with dust in every crease of his clothing and a certified document in his coat pocket that felt, absurdly, like a small weapon. He did not go to the Aldridge Ranch that night. He went to his rented room above the barber shop and slept for 9 hours, and then, on Sunday morning, he went to see Gideon Marsh. Marsh lived in the finest house in Redemption, which was not saying a great deal, but it had a covered porch and real glass windows, and Marsh himself opened the door in a silk waistcoat and the look of a man who had been expecting this visit. "Covington," he said, with the measured pleasure of someone who had been waiting for something to fall their way. "Come in." They sat in Marsh's study, which smelled of good bourbon and leather, and Ezekiel laid out the arrangement in plain terms. He would sell Midnight Justice for Marsh's original offer, $1,200. In exchange, Marsh would speak to Fletcher Ames and make it clearly understood that Ames would be significantly better served by reconsidering his testimony in the Aldridge case. Marsh would not threaten Ames, that was not part of the arrangement, but he would remind him of certain things and make certain points in the way that only a man who held a personal debt over another could do. Marsh listened to all of this without interrupting, and then he smiled. "You understand that horse is worth considerably more than 1,200 now." "I understand that very well," Ezekiel said. Marsh studied him for a moment. "What's your interest in the Aldridge woman, Covington?" "None of your business," Ezekiel said, pleasantly enough that it could not quite be called rude. Marsh smiled again, slightly differently this time, and extended his hand. They shook on it, which in 1882 in West Texas meant as much as a signed contract. Ezekiel went to the livery after that, and he stood in the stall with midnight justice for a longer time than was strictly necessary. The stallion pressed his broad forehead against Ezekiel's chest in the familiar way he had always done, a habit from his foal days that had never quite left him, and Ezekiel stood with one hand on the horse's neck and looked at nothing in particular for a while. Then he patted the animal once firmly and walked away, and he did not allow himself to look back. Gideon Marsh came to collect the horse that afternoon. Ezekiel did not watch. The thing that happened next was not something Ezekiel had anticipated, which was that Kate Aldridge saw Gideon Marsh leading midnight justice out of the livery yard on Monday morning and understood immediately that something significant had occurred. She was in town for supplies when she saw it. She stood very still on the opposite side of the street and watched Marsh lead the magnificent black horse toward his property, and something about the sight struck her as deeply wrong, not because she had any reason to connect it to her own situation, but because she had seen Ezekiel Covington at the livery twice in the past week, speaking to that horse with the unmistakable intimacy of an owner, and she had a strong instinctive sense of what that animal meant to him. She asked Dottie Sellers about it because Dottie knew everything. "Oh, he sold him," Dottie said, with the slightly theatrical gravity of someone delivering news they knew mattered. "Gideon Marsh bought him. I heard it was done yesterday morning. Cash sale." "Why?" Kate said. Dottie gave her a look that was half curiosity, half something softer. "Nobody seems to know," she said. "Covington hasn't said a word about it to anyone." Kate carried that information with her for the rest of the day, turning it over and examining it from different angles. She did not go to Ezekiel directly. She was not yet sure what she would say if she did. What she did not know, could not know, because Ezekiel had been careful, was that Gideon Marsh had spoken to Fletcher Ames on Sunday evening, and that their conversation had been long and private, and that Ames had left it looking pale and considerably less certain of his plans than he had arrived with. On Tuesday, Fletcher Ames walked into the courthouse and presented a written statement to Judge Holt's clerk. The statement declared that he had agreed to provide false testimony in the matter of Aldridge versus the Harker County Land Office, that he had been compensated by Silas Drury to do so, and that he was recanting the entirety of his previous statements. The clerk brought the statement directly to Judge Holt. By Wednesday morning, the news was all over redemption. Kate heard about it at 8 o'clock from Richie, who had heard it from Tomas, who had heard it from someone at the feed store. She stood in the yard with her coffee cup in her hand and felt something shift in her chest, not yet relief, because she had learned not to rely on relief before the thing was truly resolved, but something adjacent to it, a loosening. She went to the courthouse herself to confirm it with the clerk, who showed her the statement with the evident pleasure of a man who had known all along that the Drury claim was wrong. She read it twice, very carefully. Then she told the clerk that she also had access to certified death records for Robert Chambers that would further undermine the documented case against her father, and the clerk's eyebrows rose. "You should bring those in immediately," he said. "I intend to," she said. But first she needed to find Ezekiel Covington. She located him at the livery, which might have seemed like an odd place for a man who no longer owned a horse there, but it made a certain sense. He was leaning against the fence of the paddock with his arms folded and his eyes on the middle distance, and there was something in his posture that was very quiet and very still in the way that covers over something that is not quiet at all. "Mr. Covington," she said. He turned and saw her and straightened. Miss Aldridge. She stood in front of him and looked at him directly. Fletcher Ames has recanted his testimony, she said. I heard that, he said. And you brought me certified death records from Comanche County. I left them at the courthouse clerk's office this morning, he said. He'll have them filed by afternoon. She was quiet for a moment. The morning was heating up quickly, the way August mornings did in West Texas, and a horse in the paddock behind her moved lazily through the dust. You sold your stallion, she said. I did, to Gideon Marsh. That's right. And Gideon Marsh went to Fletcher Ames, and Ames recanted his testimony. Ezekiel met her gaze and said nothing. You did that, Kate said. You sold your horse so that Marsh would go to Ames. That's what happened. That's a lot of assumptions, he said, but he said it without any real conviction, and they both knew it. Kate took a breath that was slightly less steady than she would have liked. That horse was worth 3 times what Marsh paid you, she said. Everyone in town knows what midnight justice was worth. People know the price of things and not the value, he said. Those are different. She stared at him. There was something rising in her that she could not immediately name, not anger, though it had the same heat, and not gratitude either, though that was there too. It was something closer to being seen, and she was not accustomed to being seen, not like this. Why? She said. And please don't tell me it was about my father, because I don't think that's the whole truth. He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. A wagon went past on the street behind her, kicking up a small cloud of summer dust. Your father was a good man, Ezekiel said finally, and what was being done to his name was wrong, and you were the one carrying it, and you had been carrying it alone for a long time. That's enough reason. It was not a declaration. It was something more careful than that, something that acknowledged what he felt without demanding anything in return, and that carefulness was in its own way more affecting than a more direct statement would have been. Kate looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something she had not planned to say. Would you like to come for supper on Friday? Tomas makes a good stew. The corner of Ezekiel's mouth moved in the slight, controlled way that was apparently as close as he generally got to a full smile. I would like that, he said. She nodded once, as if they had agreed on something practical, and then she walked away toward the courthouse with the certified death records, and she only allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything once she was around the corner and out of his sight. The hearing before Judge Holt was rescheduled for the following Monday, in light of the new evidence. Silas Drury arrived with his attorney, a man from San Antonio named Beaumont, and Beaumont was very good at his job. He argued that Ames's recantation was itself suspect, that it could have been coerced, and that the death records, while compelling, did not by themselves prove the documents were forgeries. Judge Holt was a deliberate man who took his time. He listened to both sides over the course of a full morning, and then he took the afternoon to review the documents himself. He compared the dates, he examined the certified records from Comanche County, he read Ames's written statement 3 times, and then he called both parties back into his courtroom in the late afternoon. The gallery was nearly full. Most of Redemption had found reasons to be at the courthouse that day. Kate sat at the respondent's table with her hands folded and her back very straight. She had worn her best dress, which was a dark blue calico that had been her mother's, and her hair was down in a way she rarely permitted herself, and she looked, several people thought, exactly like someone who was refusing to be afraid. Ezekiel Covington sat in the back row of the gallery. He had found a seat early and had not moved since. Old Gus Painter was beside him and had been talking in a low, steady voice for most of the morning. But Ezekiel had heard very little of it because he was watching Kate and thinking about things he had not yet found words for. Judge Holt delivered his ruling in the flat, precise language of a man who had learned to let his decisions do the talking. The fabricated nature of the documents was, in his assessment, sufficiently established by the combination of the certified death registry and Ames's recantation to shift the burden of proof entirely to the plaintiff. Since the plaintiff's entire evidentiary case rested on documents that were now demonstrably suspect, and since no additional corroborating evidence had been presented, the claim against the Aldridge estate was dismissed. The land lien was dissolved. The Aldridge name, as pertaining to the specific charges in question, was cleared of the record. The gallery exhaled. Several people began talking at once. Gus Painter said something heartfelt and profane. Silas Drury sat very still for a moment, and then he stood and straightened his coat and walked out of the courtroom without a word, and Beaumont followed him, and that was the last anyone in Redemption ever saw of either of them. Kate did not move for a long moment. She sat with her hands still folded on the table, and then she looked up at the ceiling, a plain, rough-hewn ceiling with a water stain in one corner, and she allowed herself one long, steadying breath. Then she stood up and thanked the judge, who shook her hand and said her father would have been glad. When she turned to leave, she found Ezekiel standing at the low railing that separated the gallery from the floor of the courtroom. He was holding his hat in both hands, which was the only visible sign that the moment had any particular hold on him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. She looked at him with the Creekwater eyes that had changed to something clearer now, something lighter. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he confirmed. Friday supper at the Aldridge Ranch was the first of what became many Friday suppers, though neither of them said so in advance. Tomas's stew was everything promised and more, and Richie sat at the table with the particular alertness of a teenager who is trying to understand what is happening between adults without appearing to try. After supper, Richie and Tomas found reasons to be elsewhere, which Ezekiel thought showed good judgment on both their parts. He and Kate sat on the porch as the sun went down behind the hill line, and the sky turned the colors it turned in West Texas evenings, layers of orange and rust, and a deep blue-purple that seemed to come up from the ground rather than down from the sky. It was one of the things Ezekiel had always found remarkable about this country, the way the sky performed every evening with total commitment. They talked. Not about the case, not about Drury, not about the horse, none of that, not yet. They talked about smaller things first, which was the right order. She told him about her father's methods for reading weather, which Harold had learned from a Comanche man he had traded with in the early years, a system that involved the behavior of certain birds and the way moisture felt in the air at particular times of day. Ezekiel listened with genuine attention, because it was genuinely interesting, and because listening to Kate Aldridge talk about something she cared about was its own kind of pleasure. He told her about the breeding program he had built, the careful and patient work of selecting for temperament and endurance, and the particular quality he called groundedness in a horse, the ability to remain calm in situations that would unsettle a lesser animal. He explained what midnight justice had been, not just as a financial asset but as the proof that the system worked, that patience and care produced something that couldn't be rushed or shortcut. She listened in the same way he had listened, with her full attention, and when he stopped she didn't say anything sympathetic or reassuring about the horse, which he appreciated. She just looked at him in the gathering dark and said, "You'll build another. You have the knowledge." The horse was the proof of it. It was exactly the right thing to say, and he looked at her with something that had been building since the general store doorway and had not found an outlet until this moment. "I think so too," he said quietly. They sat on that porch until the stars were fully out and the night insects were doing their full performance, and Kate said she supposed he had a ride back to town. He said he supposed he did. He stood and put on his hat and she stood too, and they were close enough that neither of them moved away, and the air between them had that particular quality of a moment that is making room for something. He took her hand, the way a man does when he is being careful and deliberate about it, and held it for a moment, and then he raised it very slightly and let it go. "Next Friday," he said. "Next Friday," she said. He rode back to Redemption in the full dark with the stars overhead and the night smell of sage and dry grass around him, and he was smiling in a way that would have surprised anyone who saw him, because it was not his usual restrained, slight expression. It was something considerably more unguarded, and he was glad there was no one to see it. The weeks that followed were the kind of time that settles into a person's memory differently than other time, not as a sequence of events but as a texture, a feeling that was particular to those weeks and could not be reconstructed later in the same way it existed while it was happening. Ezekiel and Kate saw each other 3 or 4 times a week. Sometimes he came to the ranch to help with fence work or to look at a problem with the water trough that Tomas had been working around for months. Sometimes she came to town, and they walked to the edge of the creek that ran behind the church and sat on the big flat rocks in the late afternoon and talked. Sometimes they did not talk much at all, and that was comfortable too. There was a quality to their time together that felt, to both of them, like being recognized, the particular relief of being with someone who did not require you to be anything other than what you were. Kate had spent a long time being read as either too much or too little by most people in redemption, too capable to be sympathetic, too proud to be pitied, too independent to be approachable. Ezekiel did not find any of that problematic. He found it, in fact, exactly right. And she found in him something she had not expected to find in a man she had initially assessed as a quiet stranger with a private agenda. A genuine interior life, a steady humor that was dry and understated, and a kind of moral clarity that was not rigid but was deep, the kind that does not make a performance of being good but simply is. One evening in late August, sitting on the flat rocks by the creek, she asked him directly about the horse. She had been not asking for weeks, out of a courtesy she thought he might need, and now she thought perhaps she had been wrong about that. "Tell me about Midnight Justice," she said. "Not the trade, before that, what he was to you." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. The creek was low in August, as it always was, running thin and clear over the pale stones. "He was the thing I built from the beginning," Ezekiel said. "His dam was the first horse I bought with my own money when I was 22. I chose her for specific things, for her temperament, her endurance, the intelligence in her eye. And when Justice was born, everything I had hoped for was there. You could see it from the first week. He paused, choosing the word carefully. He was patient. That's a rare thing in a young horse. Most young horses are all energy and no wisdom. He was both, and that combination is what I was trying to produce. Breed it consistently, and you have something that changes a bloodline for a generation." "And now Marsh has him," Kate said. "Marsh will breed him well enough," Ezekiel said. "He knows horses. But the bloodline will be Marsh's, not yours." "Yes," he was quiet again. "That part I made peace with." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know something," she said. "I'm going to tell you this once, and I won't make a ceremony of it. What you did for my father's name and for this ranch, I have no way to repay that. Not in any currency I have. And I know you'll say it isn't necessary, but I want you to know that I understand the cost of it. I understand exactly what you gave." He looked at her. The late light was catching the gray-green of her eyes and the loose strands of hair that had come out of her braid in the afternoon breeze. She was not a woman who said things she didn't mean, and she was not a woman who said them lightly, and the fact that she had just said this thing with exactly the directness and seriousness it deserved made him feel something that was very difficult to hold in the chest without doing something about it. "Kate," he said, and his voice was different when he said it, lower and more direct than his usual even tone. "Yes," she said. "I need to tell you something, and I want to be straight about it." "All right," she said. "I didn't do what I did entirely because of your father," he said. "I did it because of you. Because I saw you in that general store, and I saw how you held yourself and what you were carrying alone, and I thought—" He stopped, then started again, more deliberate. "I thought that a woman like that shouldn't have to carry it alone, and I wanted to be the one who helped to put it down." The creek ran quietly between its stones. Something moved in the scrub brush on the far bank, a small animal, unconcerned with any of this. Kate Aldridge was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now, But her eyes changed in the way they did when she felt something deeply, that quality of light shifting, of the gray-green becoming something warmer. "You are a very singular man, Ezekiel Covington," she said. "I have been told I am a fairly strange one," he said, and she laughed, which was the sound he had been wanting to hear for most of the summer without quite admitting it. He reached across the space between them on the flat rock and took her hand, and this time he did not let go. September came in hot and slowly began to cool at its edges. The ranch work intensified with the season. There were cattle to move to the fall pasture, the last of the garden to put up, a section of fence on the north end that needed replacing before winter. Ezekiel found himself at the Aldridge ranch more days than not, and nobody made particular comment on this because it had become a visible and accepted thing. Tomas, who had worked for the Aldridge family for 9 years and had the right to an opinion, told Richie one afternoon that Covington was a man who knew how to work beside a person without needing to be in front of them, and that this was a quality worth paying attention to. Richie, who was 16 and therefore knowledgeable about most things, agreed with this assessment. Ezekiel had begun to think seriously about his next step with the breeding program. He had the knowledge and the methodology, those things Midnight Justice had proven and could not take with him when he was sold. What he needed was to start again, which required a mare of the right quality, and for that he needed money. He had some savings, enough to begin modestly, but the path back would be a longer one than the path that had gotten him to justice. He mentioned this to Kate one morning over coffee in the ranch kitchen, not as a complaint but as a plan. He laid it out clearly, the realistic timeline, the specific qualities he would look for in a new foundation mare, the markers by which he would know whether a foal was developing toward what he wanted. Kate listened, then said, "There's a horse at the Bellamy spread about 12 miles east, a bay mare. She was their trail horse, but she's been in the paddock all summer with a minor tendon issue, and Bellamy's son is tired of her taking up space. I've seen her move. She has something in her gait I couldn't name exactly but couldn't stop watching." He looked at her. "What color of bay?" "Dark bay, almost black in low light, white blaze on her face." He was already thinking. "How old?" "5, maybe 6. "I could ask. I'd like to see her," he said. 2 days later they rode out to the Bellamy spread together, and the mare was exactly as Kate had described. Dark bay, strong-boned, with an alertness in her expression that was immediately compelling. Ezekiel spent 40 minutes with her, watching her walk and trot in the paddock, assessing her recovery from the tendon issue, studying the angle of her hocks and the depth of her barrel and the particular quality of her attention. Kate stood at the fence and watched him work with the same focused interest she brought to everything. He bought the mare for $60, which was less than she was worth and more than Bellamy's son wanted to argue with. On the ride home, he said, "You have a good eye." "My father taught me what to look for," Kate said. "He said a good horse is the most honest thing you can invest in because it can't lie to you about what it is." "He was right about that," Ezekiel said. He paused. "He was right about a number of things, from what I can tell." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had the whole summer in it. He had been boarding at the room above the barber shop since his arrival in Redemption, but that arrangement was clearly a temporary one, and both of them knew it without having yet said so aloud. There was a conversation approaching, the kind that changes the structure of your life when you have it, and they were both aware of it the way you are aware of a storm on the horizon before any cloud appears in the immediate sky. It was a Sunday evening in early October when that conversation finally arrived, as such conversations tend to do, not at a planned or particularly auspicious moment, but naturally, the way water finds the lowest ground. They were sitting on the porch again, which had become their customary place for the kind of talking that mattered, and the night was cooler than it had been, with a smell of coming autumn in the air. "I've been thinking," Ezekiel said. "I thought you might have been," Kate said. "I'd like to stay," he said. "Not at the barber shop, here in this county, on this land if you'd have me." She was quiet for a moment, The night was very still. "Is that a proposal?" she asked. "It is," he said, "if you'll accept it from a man who came to town with good intentions and a prize horse and is now down to one new mare and a collection of intentions that I think are still pretty good." She looked at him in the way she had of looking at him, directly, fully, without the deflections that most people used. Then she said, "I'll accept it from exactly that man, yes." He exhaled in a way that was more revealing than he probably intended, and then he smiled, the full, unguarded smile that he had been giving her more freely over the past weeks, and reached across and took her face in his hands and kissed her. And she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything. And the night continued to be still around them, and the stars over West Texas were enormous and indifferent and utterly beautiful. The wedding was held in November, at the church with the crooked steeple, on a morning that was cold and clear and flooded with pale autumn light. The town of Redemption turned out in numbers that surprised everyone, which was perhaps an indication of how deeply the Aldridge situation had lodged itself in the community's conscience, and also an indication that Kate Aldridge, for all that she was not easily approachable, was deeply respected. Gus Painter sat in the front row and wept without embarrassment, which he later explained was for Harold, who he believed would have approved strongly. Tomas stood very straight in the back, and Richie wore a borrowed jacket that was somewhat too large for him, and looked simultaneously uncomfortable and pleased. Dottie Sellers cried before the ceremony had even properly started and blamed it on the cold air, which convinced nobody. Kate wore her mother's blue dress again, let out slightly at the seams because it had been made for a smaller woman, and she had left her hair down, and she carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that she had gone out at dawn to gather herself from the hillside behind the ranch because she had not wanted purchased flowers. Ezekiel stood at the altar and watched her walk up the aisle, and had the profound and somewhat overwhelming sensation of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he had been traveling toward. Reverend Alcott married them with appropriate solemnity and a brevity that everyone appreciated, and when it was done and Ezekiel kissed his wife, the words sitting in his mind with a warmth he had not expected from a single syllable, the church made the particular sound of a group of people who had been holding something in and have just let it go. They had supper at the ranch that evening, a genuine celebration with food enough for twice the people there, and there was music. Old Abe Custer brought his fiddle, as he brought it to everything, and played until well past dark. People danced on the hard ground outside, and the fire was high and the night was cold and clear, and late in the evening Ezekiel found Kate standing slightly apart from the group looking at the sky with an expression he was still learning to read. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That my father would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," he said. "He would have tested you first," she said. "He tested everyone, but once you passed he was loyal completely. What would the test have been, do you think?" She considered this seriously. "He would have asked you to help him fix something that didn't need fixing," she said, "and then watched how you approached it. He believed you could tell everything about a man by whether he worked with what was there or tried to make it something different." Ezekiel thought about this. "I hope I would have passed." "You would have," she said with a confidence that was not hollow. "You work with what's there. You've always done that." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, which was a thing she did not do easily and which, when she did it, carried particular weight. The winter was a working one, as all winters were in that country. The ranch required constant tending animals through the cold, feed management, water that froze and needed breaking, a section of roof that began to leak in December and required 2 days of repair in temperatures that made the work miserable. Ezekiel was there for all of it, working beside Tomas and Richie and Kate herself, because there was no version of his life in this place that involved watching others do what needed doing. The bay mare, they had named her Sundance, for no more complicated reason than that it fit her, was stabled through the worst of the winter and showed every sign of being exactly what Ezekiel had hoped for. The tendon issue had fully resolved. Her temperament was exceptional, Not placid, because he did not want placid, but steady, curious, and self-possessed in the way that distinguished a truly fine horse from a merely good one. He had made contact, through winter letters, with a man in Central Texas who had a young stallion of excellent lineage available for breeding purposes. The arrangement was not cheap, but was within possibility, and he and Kate had discussed the ranch finances with the clear-eyed honesty that was characteristic of their approach to everything. The ranch's cattle operation was modest but solid, and with some strategic decisions about which stock to develop and which to sell, the numbers could be made to work. It would take 3 years, perhaps 4, before the breeding program was self-sustaining. But Ezekiel had a long patience for things worth building, and Kate understood long-term thinking in the way that only someone who has inherited responsibility rather than opportunity ever truly does. They built a life together in the way that people do when they are genuinely suited to each other, not without friction, because they were both strong-willed and had clear opinions, but with a quality of repair that was natural and honest. When they disagreed, they said so plainly. When something was wrong, they said that plainly too. And when things were right, which was more often than not, in the interior of their particular life together, they said that too, and meant it. By spring, Kate was expecting their first child, which she announced to Ezekiel with characteristic directness one morning over the breakfast table. He received the information in a silence that lasted about 4 seconds, and then he stood up and came around the table and put both arms around her, and held her in a way that was not his usual manner, which was deliberate and careful. He held her the way you hold something that matters more than you had words for, and she felt it and put her hand against his face and said, "We are going to be all right," which was something she had learned to say and believe in equal measure. Richie's reaction was a complicated mixture of excitement and the heightened dignity of someone who is about to become something adjacent to an uncle. Tomas said something in Spanish that Ezekiel did not entirely follow, but that involved the word blessed and a reference to Harold that made Kate's eyes bright. The baby was born in October, a boy, sturdy and loud from his first minutes, with his mother's wide eyes and his father's hands. They named him Harold James Covington Harold for his grandfather, James for Ezekiel's father, and his arrival reordered everything in the way that babies do, by making the things you thought were central suddenly peripheral, and revealing what had always been the actual center. Gus Painter came to meet the baby 3 days after the birth, and sat with Harold James in the crook of his arm for a long time, not saying much, and then said to nobody in particular that Kate Aldridge would have eaten this boy up, which was the highest compliment available in the vocabulary Gus had built over 72 years of living. The breeding program, meanwhile, was developing with the methodical progress that Ezekiel had always expected from it. Sundance, bred to the Central Texas Stallion in the spring of that first year, produced a foal the following spring, a dark bay colt with white stockings on his front legs that Ezekiel noticed before anything else, and that he said nothing about, but that Kate, watching his face when he saw the foal for the first time, understood completely. He did not name the colt immediately. He spent 3 months watching him, evaluating his development, studying his temperament and movement with the same systematic attention he brought to every animal he worked with. Then one morning in the early summer he said to Kate simply, "I want to call him Redemption." She thought about this. "For the town, for the thing," he said, "the act of it, not the place." She nodded. "Redemption," she said. "Yes." The colt grew into everything Ezekiel had hoped for and then some. He was not identical to Midnight Justice. He had a different quality of stillness, less dramatic, more interior. But he had that same fundamental characteristic that Ezekiel had always called groundedness, the capacity to remain present and calm when everything around him was loud or strange or threatening. It was the thing that made a horse truly useful and truly trustworthy, and it was, Ezekiel reflected, not an entirely bad characteristic in a person either. In the 3rd year of their marriage, Kate was expecting again, and this time the baby arrived in February, a girl, smaller than her brother had been, with dark chestnut hair already showing at the crown, and a manner of looking at you that suggested she was filing the information for later use. They named her Mary Elise. Harold, who was now 2 and fully committed to the project of toddlerhood, received his sister with a measured but ultimately positive assessment. The years moved in the way that years do when you are building something together, with a sense of accumulation, of things being added to the structure of a life, sometimes with difficulty and sometimes with unexpected grace. Richie grew into a young man of 19 who had developed a genuine talent with horses and who had been largely trained by Ezekiel over the 3 years they had worked together, and who had elected to stay on at the ranch rather than try his fortune elsewhere, a decision Ezekiel supported and Kate was quietly glad of. Tomas was getting older and moved more slowly than he once had, but he was as essential to the operation as he had ever been, with a knowledge of the land and the animals and the particular rhythms of the ranch that no one else possessed in quite the same way. Ezekiel had made one journey in the second summer of their marriage, back to the region where he had grown up, and he had come back with something he had not gone looking for. A letter of acknowledgement from Gideon Marsh, who, apparently in a moment of uncharacteristic candor, had written to say that Midnight Justice had proven to be everything Ezekiel had always said he was, had won the West Texas Cattlemen's Championship that first autumn, and had begun producing offspring that were already being talked about in the region. Marsh had said, in the careful language of a man who would never use the word sorry when he could construct a compliment instead, that he hoped Covington knew the animal had been in good hands. Ezekiel showed the letter to Kate, who read it and said that Marsh was a man who knew the value of things after all. Just not always while he has them, Ezekiel said, and Kate laughed, and that was the end of that. There was one afternoon in the 4th year of their marriage that lodged itself in Ezekiel's memory with particular clarity. It was a June afternoon, the kind of afternoon West Texas produces in its good seasons, hot, yes, but with a breeze that moved through the grass and made the whole landscape shift and shimmer in a way that felt alive. He had been working with Redemption in the paddock, and the colt had had a session that was as good as any Ezekiel had ever experienced. That quality of complete, mutual understanding between horse and rider that arrives rarely and cannot be manufactured. He came in from the paddock and found Kate sitting on the porch with Mary Elise in her lap, and Harold at her feet, engaged with a collection of stones that he had arranged with great personal significance. Kate was reading something. She had always been a reader, and since things had stabilized, she had been working through a collection of books she had ordered from a catalog out of San Antonio, and she looked up when she heard his step. She saw his face and said, "Good session." "Very good," he said. He sat down beside her and stretched his legs out and looked at the yard and the fence line and the road beyond and the hill that turned purple in the evenings. "Are you happy?" she said. Not with anxiety, not as a test, just as a genuine question, the way she asked all her genuine questions. He thought about it for a moment, not because the answer was uncertain, but because he wanted to give it the respect it deserved. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," he said, "by considerable measure." She looked at him with the eyes that still changed with the light, and she smiled the way she smiled when she was genuinely pleased rather than merely polite, which was a smile that started at the corners and arrived fully only after a moment. "Good," she said. "Me too." Harold looked up from his stones with the interest of a 3-year-old who has detected that something is happening between adults that might be relevant to him. He stood up and walked with determined unsteadiness to Ezekiel's leg and placed one hand on his knee and looked at him with an expression of complete seriousness. "Papa," he said. "Hello," Ezekiel said. Harold appeared to have made a point and was satisfied. He returned to his stones. They were quiet for a while, the 4 of them on the porch in the June afternoon, and the breeze moved through the grass, and the ranch was what it had become, a place that was whole. The following spring brought something that had been building for a while in the cattle trade, a regional association meeting in Abilene at which a number of ranch operators were discussing both the possibilities and the problems of the changing market as the railroad extended further into the territory and the long drives that had defined cattle culture in the early 1870s became less necessary. Ezekiel attended as a Harker County representative, which was a thing that had happened gradually and without much ceremony. He had simply become someone whose opinion was sought, first at the local level and then somewhat beyond it. He brought back from that meeting a piece of news that was relevant to their particular plans, a program being established by several of the larger associations to evaluate and certify quality breeding stock across the region, a formal recognition that would make it significantly easier to sell the horses Redemption was beginning to produce at prices that reflected their actual quality. He explained this to Kate over supper with the specific enthusiasm he reserved for things that were actually going to work. She listened carefully and then said, "When is the next evaluation period?" "October," he said. "Redemption will be 4 years old then," she said. "Is that too young?" "No," he said. "He's ready, more than ready." She looked at him across the table in the candlelight, and there was something in that look that was both old years of working beside him, years of knowing his rhythms and his silences and his particular way of being in the world, and new, perpetually new, the way a person you love always remains slightly surprising. "Then let's enter him," she said. October came. The evaluation was held in a town called Caldwell, where a panel of 3 experienced horsemen assessed the animals presented by over a dozen breeders from across the south-central Texas region. It was a 2-day affair, formal in its way, with the particular seriousness that people in that era and that culture brought to matters of livestock quality. Ezekiel brought Redemption and handled him himself, as he always did, and the colt, though calling him a colt was less accurate with each passing month, because he was filling into a full horse now, broad and deep, and carrying himself with the self-possession that was his primary characteristic, performed with the steady, unshowy excellence that was his nature. On the second afternoon, the panel chair, a gray-bearded man from Gonzales County named Harmon, came to Ezekiel at the paddock fence and said, in the way that men of his type said things, which was to say with the minimum words necessary, "That is a horse worth watching, Covington." "Where did the dam come from?" Ezekiel said. "My wife found her." Harmon looked at him and then looked at the horse and then back at Ezekiel, and nodded once, which in the language of Harmon was approximately equivalent to a full paragraph of enthusiasm from anyone else. Redemption received the association's highest certification rating, and the paperwork was sent to ranch operators across 4 counties. Within the month, Ezekiel had received 3 serious inquiries about offspring, and 1 offer for Redemption himself that he declined without particular drama. He was not going to sell this horse. Some things you know in advance. He told Kate about the certification that evening, and she was pleased with a quietness that was characteristic of the things that genuinely moved her. She became more still, not less, when she was truly satisfied by something, as if the feeling required stillness to be fully felt. "Your father would have been proud of this," he said, "of what this place has become. He would have been proud of you," she said, "for all of it, from the beginning." The mention of the beginning was not painful, which was perhaps the truest measure of where they were. The beginning, the fabricated charges, the hearing, the cost of the horse had become part of the story of the ranch and of their life together, not a wound but a foundation stone, something that had had to happen for the rest of it to be possible. Ezekiel had told Kate, in the 2nd year of their marriage, the full truth of what the sale of Midnight Justice had cost, not just financially, but in terms of the future that horse had represented, the bloodline he had intended to establish, the competition he had been positioned to win. He had told her this not as a complaint or even as a confession, but because he believed she had the right to know, and because he was a man who found long silences about important things increasingly untenable. She had listened to the full account without interrupting him, and then she had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "I'm glad you told me. I want you to know that what you did, not the sacrifice of it, but the reason behind it, the fact that you saw something wrong and chose to address it at real cost to yourself, and then never said a word about it to anyone, that is the most remarkable thing I have ever known someone to do. And I am aware every day that I am married to the man who did that." He had not known what to say to that which was unusual for him, and he had said nothing for a moment, and then he had said, "You make it easy to be that man." "You were already that man," she said. "I just had the good fortune to need one." The 5th year of their marriage brought another milestone in the form of a second son, born in July with a healthy set of lungs and a shock of dark hair, and an immediate and apparently permanent expression of interested curiosity. They named him Robert, not for any of the figures in the story that had brought them together, but for Ezekiel's older brother, who had died of a fever when they were young men, and whom Ezekiel had carried quietly in his heart ever since. Kate had suggested the name when he mentioned his brother one winter evening, and the offer of it had been the kind of gift that doesn't announce itself as a gift, which was her way. Harold, who was 5 by now and deeply opinionated about most things, welcomed his new brother with an air of senior authority and a declared intention to teach him about horses as soon as he was sufficiently developed to benefit from instruction. Mary Elise, at 3, was more practically focused and immediately attempted to pick Robert up, which required swift intervention. The ranch by the end of that 5th year was a going concern of a scope that Harold Aldridge, had he been alive to see it, would have recognized as built on his foundation while being clearly something beyond what he had managed to create in his lifetime. The cattle operation had been refined and was consistently profitable. The breeding program was producing horses that were beginning to carry a regional reputation attached to the Covington Aldridge name. They had combined the names on the breeding records, which felt right to both of them. They employed Tomas on a full formal wage now, and Richie had grown into the role of lead hand with a competence that had surprised him and no one else. There had been a small ceremony at the church in the late fall of that 5th year, a community gathering that Reverend Alcott had organized, the specific purpose of which was to formally dedicate a new section of fence around the churchyard, an entirely practical matter that had been framed as a community celebration primarily, it seemed, because the people of Redemption wanted a reason to gather and express something that had been building for several years. Gus Painter, who was now 73 and had taken on a kind of informal role as the town's living historical memory, stood up at the gathering and gave a speech that was ostensibly about the fence but was actually about Harold Aldridge, and then about Kate, and then in a sideways and gruff but genuine way about Ezekiel, and about what had been preserved and what had been built, and about what a town is supposed to be when it is working the way it should. Ezekiel sat in the back of the gathering with Robert in his arms because the boy was being fractious and needed moving, and he listened to Gus's speech with his head slightly bent, and he did not look up for a long stretch of it, and Kate, sitting beside him, put her hand on his arm and left it there. Afterward, when the gathering had turned social and the children had dispersed into chaos, and the adults had grouped into the various configurations of small-town conversation, Kate found a moment when they were briefly apart from the nearest cluster of people, and she said to him quietly, "He said good things about you." "He's a generous man," Ezekiel said. "He's an accurate man," Kate said. "There's a difference." They walked home later under the stars with Harold on his father's shoulders and Mary Elise holding her mother's hand and Robert in the sling Kate had fashioned out of practical necessity, and the baby wearing the particular satisfied expression of someone who has found the right position in the world. And the night was cold and clear, and the road was pale in the moonlight, and the coyotes were doing their distant, ritual conversation with each other across the hill country. "We have a good life," Harold said from above, with the confidence of a 5-year-old making an observation about the state of things. "We do," Ezekiel said. "Are we going to have more babies?" Harold asked. "That is not a decision I can forecast," Ezekiel said. Kate made a sound that was nearly laughter. "We might," she said. Harold considered this from his elevation. "I think we should have a horse first," he said. "You have a horse," Kate pointed out. "I mean one that's mine," Harold said. Ezekiel smiled up at his son. "We'll see," he said, which in parental language could mean many things and Harold had not yet learned to decode. So he accepted it with satisfaction and returned to surveying his domain from his father's shoulders. The spring of the following year, when Harold turned 6, Ezekiel took him to the paddock on a Sunday morning and showed him a young bay filly that had been born to Sundance 2 months prior and had been developing in the way that the best Covington Aldridge horses developed, steadily, with interest, and with the particular quality of composed attention that seemed to run in the line now as reliably as color. "This one is going to be yours to learn on," Ezekiel told him. "Not to ride yet. To learn what it means to be responsible for an animal. You'll feed her, you'll water her, you'll spend time with her. When she's ready and you're ready, we'll talk about riding." Harold was standing at the fence rail, looking at the filly with an expression that Ezekiel recognized. It was the expression of someone seeing something they intend to love. He had seen it on Kate's face in various forms, and on his own face in the mirror on the rare occasions he caught himself in one. "What's her name?" Harold asked. "You'll name her," Ezekiel said. Harold was quiet, considering this enormous responsibility. Then he said, "Sunbeam." Ezekiel kept his expression neutral. "Sunbeam," he said. "Because her mother is Sundance," Harold explained, with the logical precision of a 6-year-old who has thought this through. "And she has a gold patch here," he pointed to a spot on the filly's neck, "and it looks like a beam of sun." Ezekiel looked at the filly. There was, in fact, a patch of lighter color there that could, with a generous imagination, suggest sunlight. "Sunbeam," he said again. "All right." He told Kate about the name at supper, and she said, "Sunbeam is a good name for a horse," and did not smile until she had left the table, which was a feat of considerable self-discipline. The years continued to do what years do when the life they contain is good. They added to each other, each one bringing its particular difficulties and its particular abundances, its losses and its satisfactions, and the sum of them was something that the two people at the center of it could not have anticipated from any single point along the way. Tomas died in the 7th year, in the winter, peacefully and in his sleep, which was as good an end as a man could ask for after a life of the kind Tomas had lived. He left behind a family in the town, a daughter and her husband and 3 grandchildren, and he left behind a piece of the ranch's character that could not be replaced but could be honored, and the Covington Aldridges made sure it was. Kate spoke at the funeral service and said things about Tomas that made his daughter weep and nod, and Gus Painter, who had come despite the cold and his age, said afterward that Kate Aldridge had always known how to see people truly. Richie was 23 by this time, and had been quietly spending Sunday afternoons for the better part of a year with a young woman named Clara Voss, whose family had a small homestead 2 miles south. Clara was quick and capable, and had the kind of humor that operated so dry it took you a second to realize you were laughing, which was a quality Ezekiel appreciated. Richie asked Ezekiel's advice on the matter one evening in February with the earnest nervousness of a young man who knows what he wants and is slightly terrified of wanting it so clearly. Ezekiel gave him the only advice he had that he trusted completely, which was, "Say what you mean. Don't dress it up. She'll know the difference." Richie married Clara that same spring, at the same church with the same crooked steeple, and Ezekiel and Kate sat in the 2nd row and watched with the warmth of people who have themselves been where those 2 young people are standing, and who know what is ahead of them and wish it for them fully. The breeding program, by the end of the decade, had developed to the point where the Covington Aldridge horses were a known quantity across several counties and were beginning to draw buyers from further afield. Redemption, the Stallion, had become the anchor of the whole program in the way that midnight justice had once been meant to be. And there was a kind of completion in that, a circle that had closed, though it had closed into a shape somewhat different from the one Ezekiel had originally drawn. He was 40 years old in the year the program reached this level, and Kate 34, and they had 3 children and a ranch that was working and a breeding operation that was building and a community where they were known and respected, and on the evidence, genuinely liked. Harold was 10 and managing Sunbeam with a seriousness that was sometimes hard to keep a straight face about. Mary Elise was 8 and had decided she was going to be a doctor, which was an ambition that her parents took seriously because it was hers, and because they were both people who believed the world was capable of being different from what it currently was. Robert was 5 and was showing signs of having his mother's quality of watching everything carefully before speaking, which his parents found both recognizable and touching. There was an evening in late October of that year, the 10th anniversary of the night Ezekiel had first kissed Kate on the porch in the dark, when they sat on the same porch, the porch that had been repaired and extended over the years until it was considerably grander than what Harold Aldridge had originally built, though it was still recognizably the same porch, still facing the same hill that turned purple in the evenings. The children were inside, various levels of resistance to bedtime being conducted by Richie's wife Clara, who had a gift for managing children that had proven useful to everyone. Kate and Ezekiel were alone for the first time in what felt like several days, which was the normal condition of people with 3 children and a working ranch, and the evening was exactly the right temperature, and the stars were beginning to emerge, and a barn owl was doing something far off in the dark. Kate had a cup of coffee and Ezekiel had his tobacco pipe, which was one of his few persistent indulgences, and they sat in the comfortable silence of people who have built a shared language that does not always require words. After a while, Ezekiel said, "What do you think Harold would say if he could see this?" He meant her father, and she knew it. Kate was quiet for a moment. "He would say, 'About time you fixed that fence section on the north end,'" she said perfectly, and then more softly, "and he would say that he is satisfied." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "I think that's right. He always worried that the ranch would outlast the name," Kate said, "that the land would survive but the meaning of it would get lost somewhere, that it would stop being what it had always been." "It hasn't," Ezekiel said. "No," she agreed. "It hasn't." She looked at him then, with the eyes that he knew as well after 10 years as he knew anything in the world, the gray-green that changed with the light, that had never stopped being interesting to him, that he sometimes caught himself looking at in the middle of a conversation about something entirely practical, and had to redirect himself back to the matter at hand. "I have something to tell you," she said. The way she said it was familiar, and he looked at her, and she was looking back with the particular expression that was hers alone for this kind of news, steady and slightly amused and deeply private. "Kate," he said. "Yes," she said. "Again." He laughed fully, freely, the way she had always been able to produce from him when nothing else could, and she smiled with her whole face, which was the smile she reserved for the things that moved her most, and the night was cool, and the stars were fully out, and somewhere in the house a child was being convinced to submit to sleep, and the ranch was quiet and whole and theirs. "What are we going to call this one?" he said. "I was thinking," she said, and paused with the deliberateness of someone who has already decided and is letting the moment build. "Justice." He was still for a moment. Not justice after the horse, or not only justice as a word, as the thing that had been at the beginning of everything between them, the thing that had been worth the cost of what was given and had produced, in ways that could not have been predicted, everything that followed. "Justice Covington," he said, trying it. "If it's a boy," she said. "And if it's a girl," she thought about this seriously. "Grace," she said finally. "For the same reason." He looked at the stars for a moment, and then at his wife, and then back at the dark outline of the ranch that surrounded them, the fences they had built and the horses they had raised and the life they had made together from the materials of a difficult beginning. "Justice or grace," he said. "Either way, it's the right name." She reached across and took his hand, and he held it the way he had always held it, with the full attention of a man who knows the value of what he has, not as a price, but as a thing that matters more than can be easily expressed. The barn owl called again in the dark far off. The hill to the west was a shadow against the sky. The porch was warm with lamplight spilling through the window, and the children were inside, and the horses were in their stable, and the name on the ranch gate said Covington Aldridge in letters that had weathered 2 winters now and were settling into the wood. They sat like that for a long time, not saying anything more, because everything that needed to be said had been said or was being said in the way that does not require language, in the warm weight of a hand held, in the shared quiet of a life that had been built from honesty and choice, and the willingness to pay a real price for a right thing. Redemption, the stallion, moved in the stable below the hill, his dark shape shifting in the lantern light that came from Richie's late round, and his name carried everything it was meant to carry, the act, not the place, the word in its fullest meaning. The thing that happens when something broken is made whole again, when a wrong is righted not by accident or by authority, but by the deliberate choice of a person who had everything to lose and chose what was right anyway. That was how it had started, and this was how it continued, and how it would continue in the steady accumulation of a life built well, on ground that had been won honestly, with the people who had built it standing together on the porch in the October dark, not finished yet, but whole. The child that arrived the following May was a boy, and they named him Justice, and he had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and Harold at 11 years old took the responsibility of being an eldest brother with a gravity that made everyone in the house suppress their smiles. Mary Elise, who was 9 and had not abandoned her plans to become a doctor, informed Justice on his 3rd day of life that she would be available for any medical questions he might have in future, which Kate noted in a letter she wrote to her oldest friend in San Antonio as possibly the most characteristic thing she had ever witnessed. Robert, at 6, was satisfied with the new arrival after an initial assessment period of approximately 1 afternoon, and returned to his primary occupation of watching everything carefully and saying less than you expected. The years settled around all of them in the way of good years, felt fully while they are present, and looked back on later with the particular gratitude of people who knew, even in the middle of them, that they were good. There were hard times too, because there always are in that country and in that life. A drought in one summer that tested the ranch seriously. A difficult winter the year Justice was 3 that took 2 horses and a section of the north fence, and required the whole family to work at limits. But none of it broke them, because the foundation of what they had was not fragile. It had been built of honest material, laid in honest work, and it held. Ezekiel Covington was 50 years old when Harold, his eldest son, rode Sunbeam in his first proper working cattle drive, a modest affair, just the ranch's own herd to the summer pasture. But Harold rode as if it were the Longhorn Trail to Dodge City, with a seriousness and a competence that caught in Ezekiel's chest with the particular parental feeling for which there is no adequate word in English. He watched his son ride and thought, as he sometimes did, of everything that had led here: the road north to redemption, the document in his coat pocket, the horse he had walked through the livery gates and never looked back at, the woman standing in her yard with a bucket and a smear on her cheekbone who had looked at him with those eyes that saw everything, and who had said simply, "Help you with something." It had all been worth it, every piece of it. He did not say this aloud, because he was not a man who made speeches, but he thought it clearly and completely, standing at the fence rail of the summer pasture with Kate beside him watching their son ride. And the morning was bright and the grass was high from the good spring rains, and the air smelled of sage and cattle, and the particular freshness of the Texas hill country in a good year. Kate, as if she had heard him think it, took his arm. They stood like that, watching Harold ride, while the day continued to brighten around them and the horses moved through the grass, and the ranch behind them held everything they had put into it. The years and the work and the losses and the building, and the 4 children who carried both their names and something that was entirely their own, and the graves of the people who had mattered, and the knowledge of what had been given and what had been received, and what had been made from all of it. That was the story of the Covington Aldridge Ranch in Harker County, Texas, in the years after 1882. Not a simple story, and not without its costs, but one that ended as the best ones do, not in a conclusion but in a continuation, in the ongoing life of a place and a family that had been made honest and had stayed that way, and who would rise the next morning and do the work and love what they had built together, in the good country of West Texas, under the enormous and indifferent and utterly beautiful stars.